Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today. I would like to thank the FCAT undergraduate conference organizers for granting me this platform. I'm really excited to be here and to share my project with you. Hi, my name is Magali. I'm in my last year at SFU completing a major in communications, and this past fall I enrolled in a class where we explored the role of communications in emergency management. Before I jump into some of the key learnings from my research, let me ask you this. What is your plan in case of an emergency? Are you prepared to last 3 days without outside help? Who would you call? Spoiler alert, it isn't Ghostbusters. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. If we were presenting in person, I imagine that some of you would have answers to these questions, and others might be looking at me with slight panic or looking around the room to see who, like them, had not thought about this before. If this is you, consider this an example of how clear communication and planning might save your life in the event of an emergency or disaster. To better understand this, let's first go back 11 years. It's April 20th, 2010, and in the Gulf of Mexico, a surge of natural gas ruptures through an ill-fitted concrete core aboard the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig. This event led to an estimated 200 million gallons of crude oil leaking directly into its waters. To put this into perspective, this is enough to fill over 300 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So you might be wondering, what does communications have to do with a disastrous oil spill in the southern United States? As we know, disasters can be synonymous with destruction. Not only can it take lives, but its repercussions can be felt at all levels of society, leaving long-lasting social, environmental, and economic consequences. However, not all communities will be impacted the same, and much of this depends on other factors, like a community's location, preparedness, response, and capacity. More importantly, clear communication is crucial at all levels of emergency management. This last point is particularly important, so I want you to remember it as we dive deeper into what happened during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. But first, I want to share a quick overview of emergency management and some key terms. First of all, the term disaster is not synonymous to emergency and can be differentiated by the scale of an event. While an emergency relates to an event that could be addressed by a local response, a disaster is a catastrophic event that surpasses local and at times national capacity to respond. In Canada, emergency preparedness and response are a shared responsibility between the government and the individual. In the event of an emergency, we should be prepared to go 72 hours without the help from emergency workers like first responders. There are four key phases that characterize emergency management. It's mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Mitigation and preparedness are preventative actions that can be taken to reduce the risk or impact of a potential emergency before it happens. So for example, we install smoke detectors and have a fire extinguisher on hand to both alert us of a fire and equip ourselves with the proper tools to manage it. On the other hand, response occurs immediately after an emergency, leading to fire trucks coming to our home. Finally, the recovery phase depicts the moments after the event. In this scenario, this might look like me renovating the part of my home that was damaged by the fire. Recovery can take anywhere between a few months to decades, depending on the disaster's severity. While populations and government have little control over natural disasters, their efforts to mitigate and prepare will directly impact the community's ability to recover. It's important to take note that these efforts depend on a nation's wealth, resources, and governance. Now I want you to picture yourself in a game of telephone with your friends, except instead of passing along a silly phrase or word, you're sharing key directions to what will ultimately determine the outcome of your life and that of your communities. Now imagine, instead of just playing with your friends, you're playing with more people, thousands more to be precise. Remember what I said about the importance of clear communication? This is when it might come in handy. As you can imagine, communicating between stakeholders, communities, and agencies is no easy task. Author and researcher Claire Rubin illustrates this challenge really well when describing the scale and the response matching that of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, as it ultimately involved over 48,000 people from hundreds of organizations, as well as an impressive sea and air asset including 60 US Coast Guard vessels and 22 aircrafts, 345 response vessels, 3,200 vessels of opportunity, and 127 surveillance aircrafts. This ability to communicate between emergency personnel and other involved parties across jurisdictions, fields, and levels of government is called interoperability. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was complex, but improper communication between these parties ultimately hindered their response capacity. From the moment of the spill, it was unclear which agency was responsible for leading the response. To make matters worse, certain laws contradicted each other, pointing to different jurisdictions for guidance. The impact of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is still being felt today. While this event was undoubtedly disastrous, a lot can be learned. As mentioned earlier, a community's ability to mitigate and prepare for a disaster will have direct consequences on their ability to respond. A key aspect in mitigation and preparedness is building a comprehensive emergency response plan that clearly outlines who does what, when, where, and with who. When developing an emergency response plan, it is vital to take into consideration added challenges. For example, Canada's extensive coastline presents particular challenges, as many communities are very remote and thus difficult to reach. First Nations and remote coastal communities are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of disasters, as they often depend on the land as their livelihood and for sourcing food. Emergency planning is not one size fits all. Historically, First Nations communities have been excluded from emergency planning considerations, but since then, consultation with First Nations and other Indigenous communities has been crucial in the developing and implementation of strong plans that take into consideration governance structure, capacity, and infrastructure. In other words, these plans need to be relevant and usable. This relates to the term interoperability that I mentioned earlier, because in order to have all parties successfully work together, they must first agree on a plan. And not just any plan, but a plan that accurately reflects the needs and capacity of a community. If we learned anything from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill disaster, it is that interoperability is positioned as a fundamental necessity within emergency communications. So, what does this mean for you? As you log off of this virtual conference and return to the physical sphere that is your home, I encourage you to think proactively about emergencies. Should you be isolated for 72 hours, what will you do as an individual to ensure the well-being of yourself, your household, and that of your neighbors? Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.